So, one of the things that you have to consider when learning about surrealism is the influence of Sigmund Freud. So, you have Freud's quote here: artists are the people society needs to express what most of us must learn to inhibit. It's a beautiful quote, and it really fits what surrealism is about quite well. Because Freud says that, artists are really kind of out there putting things down on canvases, sculpting things that, most of us would never even conceive of, right? So, that we need artists and they tell us about things that often most of us turn away from. So, they do kind of the hard, heavy lifting, right? If you don't know much about Freud, right, here's a slide that kind of sums up his background. He's known, of course, as the father of psychoanalysis, for better or for worse, because if you know Freud, you know that, he does have sort of a checkered history regarding, his relationship to psychoanalysis. Many people now, of course, reject most of his early thoughts on psychology for being sexist and being racist, right? Anti-religion, other sort of things. So, but again, we have to say he is the father. He comes up with the practice, and below that, you have things that he was really well known for that the surrealists will pick up and use as inspiration in their art pieces. For instance, he's really interested in the idea of like, how we learn to fetishize something or how we learn to obsess about something. And he says that these tendencies, come from our childhood, the things that we learn to sublimate. And sublimation is about pushing something down, pushing something underneath, right? Hiding it, right? When you say it's a subliminal message, right? It's something below the surface that you can't quite access normally. So, this idea of, how we learn these things. He says often we learn these things when we're young. So if you've ever heard like nature versus nurture, he's very interested in the nurture part, of how this all comes together, and often, in a sense, blames, our mothers or our fathers for, these obsessions or these fetishes or these sublimations, right, that we have. He says, how do we operate in society? Well, we learn to operate in society by understanding our psyche. And he believes very strongly that our psyche has two different parts, the id and the ego. The id is like the child inside. It's the one that has no boundaries, no rules. It's like my little nephews, right? Who, we have to tell like, look, you can't do that, or you can't yell poop in public. Like it's just unacceptable socially. And over time, right, your ego learns to manage the id. The ego is the one who's kind of like the common sense is saying, now id, you can't do those things, right? You can't go around yelling poop, right? That's just not okay. And the super ego is, in a sense, the society we live in. So, each culture has a different super ego in a sense. An American super ego might be very different than a Japanese super ego. So, it's kind of the overarching rules, right? So Freud says a lot of like our lives are about sort of learning to sublimate these things that maybe we find inappropriate. Like a lot of obsessions and fetishes are considered inappropriate. Look at something like scopophilia, which is like love of poop, right? Hate to keep saying poop, but it's something that most of us don't talk about because why would you, right? We think it's again the ego says don't do that. So we learn to manage these things and kind of push them out of the way. And we also learn the rules of our culture, right? Freud also, of course, heavily dabbled with dream theory and the discussion of how dreams, in a sense, are, as he put it, answers to questions we dare not ask. So to him, he said, there's things that we can't ask during our waking moments, but they plague us, right? So our dreams help us unravel or take apart, right, those questions, right? They give us answers to questions we don't dare to ask in our waking moments. Very interesting idea, right? And he goes through and he looks at different symbols. If you ever looked at Freudian dream theory, it's like, the teeth falling out mean, castration, and trains going through tunnels mean sex, things like this. It's a little heavy handed, but you get the point. And then, of course, you can look further into things that, he discussed regarding religion and how he said it's sort of delusional and it gives us like a herd mentality. And then, of course, his famous Oedipal Electra complexes as well. He also talked about narcissistic theory, how we often would pick a mate who looks like us, that we like mirroring, right? And things like this. So he says there's just a lot of stuff operating in our psyche that we may not even understand. That when we pick a mate, we tend to pick something maybe that looks like us, familiar to us, right? That why we're obsessed with things that we may not understand these things. So he gets into very interesting ground with all this. So he's very important to understand. Now, how can you see this in the art? Here's a Magritte where you get into the idea of fetish. And I like how it's the idea of a foot fetish, but he's made the foot